What happens when you sign a contract, a supposedly ironclad deal, but it's built on a massive mistake? A mistake that everyone involved made. Well, today we're jumping into a really cool legal case that asks that exact question. And it's all about a contract that, well, wasn't really a contract at all.
Seriously, just picture it for a second. You shake hands, you sign the papers, maybe you've even paid a big deposit. And then you realize the entire foundation of the agreement, the very thing you thought you were buying, is based on a complete misunderstanding. Are you just stuck? That's the huge dilemma we're going to unpack.
So, let's get into it. This is all about how one single shared mistake can totally unravel what looks like a rock-solid deal.
To figure this out, we have to go way back. We're talking 1924, to a case called Chillingworth versus Esche. And trust me, it's a legal classic for a very good reason. It set a standard that still protects people almost 100 years later.
Okay, so what actually went down? Well, it all kicked off with two doctors who had a pretty simple plan. Buy a piece of land. Sounds easy enough, right? But underneath that simple transaction, a giant misunderstanding was brewing.
The deal looked totally normal at first. The doctors agreed to buy the land and paid a deposit to lock it in. But then a bombshell dropped. It turned out that both the doctors and the seller were completely wrong about something super important: what could actually be built on that land. So naturally, the doctors wanted their money back. But the seller said, nope, a deal's a deal. And just like that, they were all headed to court.
And this is where things get really interesting, because that disagreement sets up this classic showdown in the legal world. It's a battle between sticking to the strict letter of the law and, just doing what's fair. So the court had to juggle two very different ideas. On one hand, you've got common law. Think of it like a rigid rule book. It basically says, hey, the contract was signed, the deal is valid, end of story. Mistake or not, the rules are the rules. But on the other hand, you have this principle called equity. Equity is more like a referee. It steps in and asks, okay, but is this outcome actually fair? It's flexible, and it's there to prevent the strict rules from leading to a totally unjust result.
The court's thinking really boiled down to this simple idea. They said, look, to force this sale would be to make the doctors buy something completely different from what they and the seller thought was on the table. And the principle of equity just couldn't let an injustice like that happen.
So if forcing the deal through was obviously unfair, but the contract was technically signed and sealed, what could the court even do? They needed a way to basically hit a giant undo button on the whole thing. And they found a really clever one.
That legal undo button has a name. It's called rescission. It's a bit of a fancy legal word, but all it really means is canceling the contract. It doesn't just change the deal, it completely erases it, as if it never happened, putting everyone back where they started.
But here's the really smart part of the court solution. They said, okay, doctors, you can cancel the contract, but there was a condition. The seller got to keep the deposit. It was a brilliant balancing act. The doctors were saved from a truly terrible deal, but the seller was compensated for their time and trouble. Nobody walked away perfectly happy, but it was a fair resolution that stopped a much bigger injustice.
At this point, you might be thinking, all right, interesting story from the 1920s, but why does this matter to me now? Well, the principle that came out of this case is actually incredibly relevant today.
What this case did was create a vital safety valve in contract law. It's a way out when a contract is built on a fundamental shared mistake. It ensures the law doesn't have to blindly enforce a deal that makes absolutely no sense and would cause real harm.
And this safety valve protects people in all sorts of modern situations. Think about buying a house, only for you and the seller to discover later there's a huge zoning issue nobody knew about. Or buying a business based on financial records that you both find out were totally wrong. Thanks to cases like Chillingworth versus Esche, there's a legal path to argue that a fundamentally unfair deal like that should just be undone.
So in the end, this case leaves us with this huge, ongoing question that the law is always trying to answer. Of course, we need contracts to be solid and dependable, but at the same time, true justice sometimes demands flexibility. It forces us to keep asking, where exactly do we draw that line to protect good people from honest but potentially catastrophic mistakes?